Imagine a cellar in the old Marais quarter, where every wax figure preserves not just the faces of executed criminals, but the last agonizing seconds of their lives. One face on the table suddenly sinks inward, as if something inside is still dying, and the sweet smell of honey turns sharp with the metallic tang of blood. Outside the workshop, every step echoes like a whisper of the names of those who are next. And just when you think it's only art, the floor rises beneath your feet, the walls seem to melt, and a single new mask stares at you with terrifying accuracy, whispering, "Do not look too long, or the next face will be yours." It begins with a hollow strike, a sound like a rib splitting under an unseen boot, although nothing living moves in the cellar. The wax that forms a human face sinks inward as if collapsing around a final breath, still searching for a path out. And for the briefest instant the air loses its honey-warm sweetness and tastes of raw, bright iron. Beyond the doors of the old Marais quarter the night remains motionless, yet the walls of the workshop seem to sway, listening with a patience bordering on cruelty, as though the dead were determined to die once more. The stillness that follows is not silence but a dense, oppressive waiting, as if the wax itself is holding its breath. The molds stand in neat rows, each marked with the initials of men whose lives guttered out hours earlier, criminals whose final contortions have been forced into shapes meant to preserve not just their likeness, but the precise instant their bodies surrendered. The masters of the workshop claim that the cellar's feverish heat is responsible for the occasional settling of a cheek or the soft buckling of a jawline. Yet the subsidence that now ripples through the face on the central table feels too deliberate, too synchronized with the imagined rhythm of a faltering heartbeat. The air thickens with the scent of cooling tallow, mingling with the acrid ghost of burnt linen from the earlier preparations. A faint tremor shivers across the waxen lips, so slight it could be dismissed as the memory of motion rather than the motion itself. Still, the shift carries within it the suggestion of a sound, an exhalation, a murmur, even the tail end of a dying man's attempt at speech. The workshop's darkened corners seem to twitch in response, as though the shadows are listening, echoing whatever whispers the wax refuses to keep to itself. A lantern flame near the stairwell flickers sideways without a draft to move it, leaning toward the table as if drawn by the gravity of that collapsing face. The tiny glossy beads forming along the edges of the mold resemble sweat on living skin, but they are too cold to the touch, forming intricate lines that trace the path of absent tears. It is as though the wax has been reminded of something its creators never intended to preserve. The terror of being seen at the moment when life narrows to a single, frantic pulse. Above the workshop, the narrow streets of the quarter remain deserted, their paving stones slick with the lingering damp of a day that never fully warmed. The windows of the houses nearby are shuttered, yet the few lightless panes that catch the moon's reflection appear to stare down into the cellar, pulled by an unseen thread. Something in the air of the district has long felt wrong, but tonight the wrongness deepens, thickens, spills inward like a tide. As the lantern steadies and the walls cease their almost imperceptible sway, the face on the table settles into its new shape. What remains bears little resemblance to the expression cast only moments before. It is drawn tight, taut with an anguish too fresh to belong to any corpse, and just as the last curve solidifies, a feeling sweeps through the cellar, chill, unmistakable, and entirely out of place. It feels like the cold breath of someone standing far too close behind you, someone whose presence should be impossible in a room filled only with the newly dead. Beneath the dim, wavering glow of the candles, the Greven masters return to their labor with the solemnity of priests tending a shrine no scripture has ever dared to describe. Their hands move with a precision shaped by years spent in the hidden craft they have convinced themselves they alone understand. They speak little, and when they do, their voices are low and hushed, tinged with the peculiar reverence of those who believe their work to be both necessary and forbidden. They take pride in calling themselves custodians of a peculiar truth, that a life, no matter how corrupt or shame-stained, can be caught in its most vulnerable instant and captured within pliant wax. Yet pride, here, is indistinguishable from dread, for each figure they complete brings them closer to a boundary none of them can name. The bodies that arrive in the cellar are still warm when the masters receive them. Sometimes the warmth comes from fading life, sometimes from the rough wool in which the constables wrap the condemned. The shivers running through the flesh can be easily mistaken for leftover flickers of breath, but the Greven masters know better than to be sentimental. They have learned to read death with the detachment of scholars, observing how the limbs stiffen, how the skin dulls, how the final contractions leave the jaw locked in a rictus of fear or fury. To them, these moments are not grotesque but essential, for the final expression must be seized before the features slacken into the calm indifference of the dead. The masters heat the wax until it reaches the exact consistency that allows it to cling, to record, to obey. It slides with slow reluctance down the sides of the copper pots, thick as liquid bone, carrying with it the faint scent of honey and smoke. They pour it into their molds with care bordering on tenderness, guiding it into the grooves that replicate every wrinkle, every line of tension, every skewed detail imprinted by terror's last kiss. The wax accepts these impressions eagerly, yielding, stretching, adapting, as though hungry for each nuance it is given. Yet in the depths of the hollowed eye sockets, something stirs. At first it manifests as the smallest vibration, like the tremor of a dying eyelid resisting its final stillness. The masters feel it rather than see it, a faint quiver that tightens their throats and makes the candle flames flicker as though pushed by an unseen breath. They dismiss it, each in his own mind, as the natural cooling of the material or as the faint settling of a mold that has not yet fully embraced its task. Such explanations are lies meant to soothe nerves stretched thin by too many hours in the oppressive cellar, but the men cling to these lies with the desperation of those who fear what truth might imply. The tremor grows more pronounced when the wax locks fully into place. It becomes a subtle tightening around the lids, a minute contraction in the corner of the lip, a tension so precisely human that even the most seasoned master hesitates before brushing his hand across the cooling surface. They tell themselves this is merely the residue of movement, a trick of the heat, a whisper of form reluctant to yield to stillness. Yet every one of them, at some point, feels the unmistakable impression of being watched from within the sculpture they have just created. The captured expressions shift ever so slightly under their scrutiny. Not enough to be unmistakable, never enough to be proven, but enough to leave a residue of unease in the mind. It is as though the wax remembers the agony it was molded to preserve and refuses to let it go, storing it within its depths like a secret that festers. For the condemned who contributed their final breath to these figures, suffering ended in a single instant. For the wax, however, the pain lingers, patient, eternal, unchanging. None of the masters dare to say aloud what they have begun to suspect, that the wax clings not only to the contours of the face, but to something deeper, something that once trembled inside the flesh and now searches for a new vessel through which to continue its terrified resistance. They fear admitting that their creations hold more than shape, that they might hold memory, or worse, intention. And so they work in silence, surrounded by rows of faces that seem to shift by candlelight, faces caught on the threshold between death and something that refuses to be named outright. The cellar feels smaller with each figure added, as though the air itself grows crowded with unfinished stories, each locked behind lips molded to hold eternal screams. They pretend not to notice the way their own shadows recoil from the statues, or the way the waxen mouths seem poised to speak if only the candle flames would waver a moment longer. But they all know. Each of them feels it in the marrow of his bones. The wax remembers too much. It always has. A feverish haze clings to the cellar, a wavering curtain of heat so thick it blurs the boundary between the living world and whatever stirs inside these waxen forms. The air trembles with a mixture of molten wax, candle soot, and the stale residue of human fear, each breath heavy enough to leave a taste on the tongue. It is the kind of heat that distorts vision and unnerves the mind, making every movement seem slower, every shadow more deliberate. Beneath this suffocating veil, The rows of mannequins take on a presence that transcends their material, as though they have begun to absorb the atmosphere that surrounds them, feeding on its dread. The mannequins stand in perfect formation, arranged with the precision of an execution lineup. Each figure preserves, in immaculate detail, the final moment of its original, a moment carved not by artistry alone but by the violent pressure of an extinguished life. Crevices along the forehead, faint grooves around the mouth, the barely perceptible twitch frozen at the corner of a lip, all remain intact, catalogued with such fidelity that the cellar resembles a gallery for the condemned. The Greven masters believe this accuracy lends dignity to their art, transforming the horrors of the city into controlled, almost sacred artifacts. Yet the effect is far from dignified. The figures exude a suffocating sense of anticipation, as though their preserved grimaces do not record death but await something past it. During the day, the wax cools into a deceptive stillness. The figures seem content to remain inert, locked in their sculpted anguish, while the masters move among them adjusting angles, trimming seams, and ensuring that no imperfection betrays the sanctity of the craft. But as the hours pass and the last candle gutters in its sconce, a subtle transformation begins to unfurl. It always begins with temperature. The cellar should cool at night, yet it warms instead, a breathless, humming heat that seems to emanate from the wax itself. The walls absorb it reluctantly, expanding with minute groans as if refusing to hold what the figures cast off. Then comes the movement, imperceptible at first, just a soft tug at the edge of a lip or a faint draw upon the eyelid. These motions do not mimic life, but something stranger. The echoes of agony repeating themselves, the body reliving its final spasms within a medium that should not move at all. The wax does not melt. It shifts with purpose, sliding into new expressions that bear little resemblance to the ones molded hours earlier. Faces lengthen, jaws tighten, brows arch as if startled by a revelation too ghastly to name. The figures do not merely distort, they refine their expressions, polishing their torments into forms more vivid and immediate. Under the dim glow of the single lantern left to burn overnight, the results are terrifyingly animate. By the time the city settles into the deepest hours before dawn, the cellar becomes a chamber of slow, urgent motion. Eyes widen, their frozen irises stretching enough to suggest they have glimpsed something beyond the physical confines of the room. Lips part as if to exhale secrets, as though the wax retains fragments of suffering that demand release. And release comes, but not in words the living can understand. Instead, soft vibrations travel upward through the cracks in the old wooden beams, slipping into the alleyways of the Marais with an eerie fluidity. The sounds resemble whispers only loosely, more like the memory of speech than speech itself, yet they carry a chilling clarity that reaches the ears of anyone unfortunate enough to pass by. Those who walk the narrow street at night report feeling watched long before they hear anything. A faint pressure settles against the skin, prickling like the aftermath of a fever. Then the murmurs thread their way toward them, brushing the edges of perception with breathy insistence. Some swear they hear names, always whispered slowly, as though the speaker savors each syllable. Others describe pleas, warnings, or fragmented confessions, carried on a wind that never stirs the air. Whatever the form, the effect is universal. Even the most hardened souls turn pale, quicken their steps, and refuse to look back. Within the cellar, the mannequins stand as they always do, their poses unchanged, their features reset into immaculate stillness by dawn. Only the faintest residue of warmth clings to them, vanishing into the cool morning air as though nothing unusual occurred. The masters arrive, exchanging uneasy glances they pretend not to notice, convinced their eyes are playing tricks. Yet each figure seems inexplicably more vivid than the day before, as though perfected by hands that no living artisan commands. And the heat lingers a moment too long, heavy with a presence that has no intention of leaving. The disappearance of the young apprentice settles over the workshop like a damp, creeping fog, the kind that seeps into the bones and lingers long after the air has stilled. No one recognizes the moment when he vanishes, His absence becomes apparent only when the first master descends into the cellar at dawn and notices the thin coat of dust on his unused tools. The boy had been diligent, almost obsessively so, always the last to abandon the suffocating heat of the workspace. For him to leave without dousing the lamps or covering the fresh molds is unthinkable, and the silence he leaves behind has a weight that feels deliberate, as though someone, or something, has taken care to erase the traces he should have left. Only one sign remains, a single handprint pressed deeply into a slab of half-cooled wax on his work table. The impression is unmistakable, capturing the spread of the fingers, the faint pressure of the palm, even a slight tremor preserved in the uneven edges. It looks less like the mark of a working hand, and more like the desperate grasp of someone reaching for stability at the very last moment. The masters examine it one by one, yet none touches it, as if the imprint radiates a heat not belonging to the cooling wax but to something trapped within it. The cellar's oppressive air thickens around the table, and the masters retreat from the sight with an unease that deepens into dread when they count the mannequins lined against the walls. There is one more figure than there should be. It stands slightly apart from the others, positioned with an almost respectful distance, as if newly arrived and not yet accustomed to the company of the dead. At first glance, its features appear unremarkable, another mask of fear, another moment stolen from someone who has met an unkind end. But the longer the masters look, the more the details sharpen into painful clarity. The line of the jaw, the curve of the cheekbone, the faint ridge of an old childhood scar, half hidden beneath meticulously sculpted strands of hair. It is the apprentice, not a likeness, not an echo. It is him, rendered with such frightening precision that breath catches in the throat of the eldest master, who alone dares to step closer. The figure's expression holds none of the theatrical contortions typical of the condemned. Instead, the face is drawn into a fragile, almost pleading stillness, as though caught in the final instant before the realization of loss becomes a scream. The wax on the cheeks glistens faintly, not with the dull shine of a polished surface, but with something wetter, softer, and terribly real. Under the lantern's tremulous light, it resembles the track of tears, the kind shed when fear collapses into resignation. A thin, almost invisible cut runs along the lower lip, as if something sharp brushed against it only moments before the wax set, though there is no blade or tool nearby that could explain such a fresh mark. Whispers begin to coil through the workshop before midday, rising from the corners of the cellar where the air never seems to move. No single voice can be identified. It is more a murmur of unease, a shifting tension that threads itself through the spaces between the mannequins. The masters attempt to resume their routines, forcing their hands into the familiar rhythms of heating, molding, and shaping, but the figure of the apprentice stands watchful, absorbing every flicker of their unease. They position it at the far end of the room, but even from that distance it feels impossibly near, as though its presence expands to fill whatever space it is given. The Marais stirs with rumors almost immediately. Neighbors notice the closed shutters of the workshop, the hurried footsteps of the masters, the way none of them meet anyone's gaze. The disappearance spreads by word of mouth, soft and uncertain at first, then louder as the hours pass. Some claim the boy fled after witnessing something unnatural. Others insist he fell victim to a crime unconnected to the workshop's clandestine trade. But no theory settles comfortably, because the air of the quarter carries a peculiar tension, a subtle imbalance that suggests a rupture no human hand could mend. Inside the cellar, the wax figure remains unchanged, yet the masters feel watched every moment they remain near it. The heat in the room thickens around the sculpture, gathering as though the wax is drawing the warmth inward, storing it like breath. The glistening on the cheeks does not fade. The cut on the lips stays sharp, refusing to dull into the lifeless smoothness of the other mannequins. And though no one admits it aloud, each man senses that the figure is not finished, that something within the wax is waiting, listening, remembering a final moment that none of the living were meant to witness. The disappearances multiply with the same soundless persistence as footsteps sinking into rain-soaked cobblestones, leaving no trace except the faint ripple of unease traveling through the quarter. First comes the vanishing of the rag picker, a man known for his stubborn presence in every alley from dawn until the first lanterns were lit. He is missed only when his absence grows louder than his muttering ever was. Then the night watchman fails to complete his rounds, his lantern found extinguished in the middle of the square, its glass unbroken but smeared with something that does not resemble soot. By the time the elderly herb seller fails to return to her cramped shop, its bundles of dried plants hanging motionless, untouched by the slightest draft, whispers have already begun to lace themselves through the neighborhood like a slow creeping frost. The Greven masters try to ignore the talk, dismissing each disappearance as the product of the city's usual dangers, a drunken scuffle, a clandestine debt, a misstep along the riverbank. But each dawn reveals a truth too blatant to dismiss. Every morning when they descend the cellar stairs, another figure stands waiting in the suffocating heat, positioned with eerie intention between the established rows. No sounds accompany these arrivals. No footprints trace the path by which the figures emerge. They appear fully formed, each with the faint sheen of wax that still retains its inner warmth, as though it has been shaped moments before the first master's foot touches the bottom step. The new figures are unmistakably modeled on the missing. The rag picker's wiry frame leans forward as if he still searches for scraps among the dead corners of the city, though his expression is hollowed by a fear no living man ever saw him display. The night watchman's posture is frozen mid-turn, a defensive twist captured with uncanny precision, as though he sensed something behind him too late. The herb seller's hands, although sculpted in wax, seem to clutch the air for balance, her features stretched into a silent plea that trembles on the edge of motion. As more figures accumulate, the cellar grows cramped, not from the statues themselves, but from something formless and oppressive pressing against the walls. The air thickens until every breath feels stolen from a shrinking space. The masters find themselves navigating the room with increasing caution, avoiding brushing against the waxen forms, though none of them will admit to the fear that the figures might respond to touch. The cellar's heat no longer seems to come from the furnaces or the pots of molten wax. Instead, it radiates from the statues, a warmth too pulsating, too deliberate, as though each sculpture houses a slow, beating heart formed from congealed suffering. The masters begin to sense a crowding that defies sight. It is a pressure at their backs, a prickling awareness that something stands just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. When they move from one workstation to another, they feel as if threads of attention tug at them, cold and heavy, weaving between the figures with the patience of something that has no need of haste. The cellar starts to feel less like a workshop and more like an antechamber to a place where silence has weight and shadows breathe. By the third week, the phrase murmured only as a measure of dread and never allowed in the workshop, the figures stand so densely that the masters can no longer distinguish the original mannequins from the new arrivals at a glance. The wax surfaces gleam with a luster that seems to deepen in the dark, absorbing even the faintest glimmer of light. In the oppressive quiet of early morning, when the cellar has not yet been disturbed by the noise of tools or footsteps, the masters think they hear a soft friction, like many bodies shifting slightly to make room for one more. The disappearances above ground continue with unnerving regularity. No signs of struggle, no belongings left behind, just absence, neat and quiet as if curated by an unseen hand. The quarter begins to empty, street by street, its inhabitants moving with hurried glances toward the workshop as though it exerts a silent pull that none dare acknowledge. Doors are barred earlier, shutters locked, lamps snuffed long before midnight. Yet the sense of being watched intensifies, as though the cellar's population has grown too vast to confine itself below the cobblestones. Inside, the wax figures stand in perfect, suffocating ranks. Their presence expands, pressing against the room, the walls, the skin of the men who must share space with them. And beneath every layer of silence, beneath every still surface, lies the simple, unbearable certainty that the cellar is no longer filling with statues. It is filling with those who stand behind them, waiting their turn to enter the wax. The end arrives without ceremony, creeping into the Greven house with the same quiet inevitability as the river fog that drifts from the Seine on windless nights. It does not knock, nor does it roar. It simply settles, seeping into the cracks of the old building until the air tastes faintly of damp stone and extinguished candles. When the masters descend the cellar stairs in the pale hours before dawn, those fragile moments when the sky hovers between ink and ash, they feel an unfamiliar heaviness, as though the steps themselves are resisting their weight. The lantern glow falters, dimming with each breath, and for the first time in many years, none of them attempt to explain it away. The wax figures wait below, arranged in perfect ranks that seem tighter than the night before, though no human hand has touched them. They do not merely stand, they watch. Their eyes, once dull and translucent, now gleam faintly, as if lit by a slow, burning ember inside the wax. The heat radiating from their bodies is unmistakable, thickening the air until every exhale feels stolen from someone else's lungs. The masters feel their gazes before they see them, an oppressive awareness pressing against their skin with the weight of an unspoken accusation. The cellar walls shift first. At a glance, the changes seem trivial, a hairline crack branching across the plaster, a subtle sag in the beams. Yet the cracks do not follow the logic of gravity or architecture. They bloom outward like fractures in a block of cooling wax. A faint drip echoes in the distance, followed by another, and another, creating a rhythm at odds with the silence of the room. When the lantern's light swings across the far wall, the truth reveals itself in a slow, quivering ripple. The surface is softening. It glistens with a sheen that catches the light like polished amber, and then a bead of pale, honey-hued substance slides downward, leaving a glossy trail behind. The walls are melting. It becomes clear that they were never walls at all, not in the ordinary sense. They were molded long ago, shaped layer by layer from discarded remnants. The sloughed-off agony of countless death masks, the residue of fear trapped beneath fingernails, the final breath of criminals forced into stillness. Over the years, the cellar absorbed these fragments of suffering, compressing them into a silent, suffocating cocoon. Now, under the pressure of its expanding population, the structure has begun to collapse inward, shedding its disguise to reveal the monstrous mass beneath. The masters turn to flee, but the floor hardens beneath their feet with unnatural speed. What was once packed earth has become a rising surface, smooth as cooling wax, swelling upward like a shallow tide. It clings to boots and hems, seizing ankles with a sculptor's certainty. Every footprint they leave is immediately filled, the impression sealing over with the slow pulse of something alive. The cellar is no longer a room. It is a mold, and they are already sinking into its memory. The wax figures do not move, yet they seem to draw closer, their presence expanding, their heat intensifying. The air vibrates with a tension too subtle to hear, yet impossible not to feel, as though countless breaths are being held in anticipation. The master's skin prickles, tightening with a cold sweat despite the oppressive warmth radiating from every surface. Their hearts stutter, unable to decide whether to pound or freeze. The rising floor reaches their knees, then their thighs, pulling with a suctioning tenderness, as if urging them into stillness. The lantern slips from a trembling hand and vanishes into the glossy surface without a sound, swallowed whole. Darkness floods the room, disrupted only by the faint internal glow of the statues, their faces shimmering with an almost feverish light. For a moment, the masters are illuminated with merciless clarity, their features stretched into silent terror, their mouths frozen in shapes that no one will ever decipher. Then the cellar tightens its grip. By the first pale light of dawn, the Greven house stands unervingly quiet. No smoke rises from the chimney. No tools clatter on the workshop tables. The street before the building feels wider somehow, emptied of the unspoken dread that once pooled there. Inside the shop window, however, a single new wax face gazes out onto the waking quarter. It is sculpted with a precision that surpasses anything the masters ever produced. Every wrinkle of fear, every fine tremor of a life startled into stillness, is preserved with chilling exactness. Its eyes, glossy, reflective, disturbingly aware, seem to follow passers-by with a patience sharpened by hunger. Those who meet its gaze hear something, a faint whisper tucked behind the glass, so soft it can be mistaken for imagination. Yet the warning is unmistakable, sliding coldly along the spine like the edge of a blade. Do not look too long, or the next mask will be yours.